Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roff, Executive Director of AIIA Victoria. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, wherever we may be here in Dyson House or the Zoom audience, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. For the next series of our Meet the Ambassador program and to talk about Ukraine and the trials and tribulations and the resilience and the courage of the Ukrainian people in the face of Russia's aggression, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Ukraine's ambassador to Australia, His Excellency, Mr. Vasyl Miroshnichenko. The ambassador we practiced. The ambassador's been here only since April 2022. He's served as an advisor to the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine. He's been a supervisory board member of the Ukrainian Institute, a cultural diplomacy organization under the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But he's had a long career before that in international communications and the NGO space. His interlocutor, John Richardson, Vice President of AIIA Victoria, and after a long career with DFAT, former Australian ambassador to Brazil. So, gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining us, and I'll hand straight over to you. We'll just get you to unmute.
Thank you, Alistair, for that kind introduction. And let me also parallel my very warm welcome to you, Ambassador Miroshnichenko. We're delighted that you could come and join us in Victoria today. We know that you made a special flight down to join us, and we're very grateful for that. And welcome also to Australia. It's a pleasure to have you here. Ambassador, I'd like to extend my sympathy at the very start, and I'm sure that of everyone here, to you, for the terrible suffering inflicted on the people of Ukraine by the Russian invasion. It's been estimated that Ukraine, as well as Russia, has suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, either killed or wounded. There has been massive damage to the Ukrainian people and Ukraine's economic and social infrastructure. But Ukraine has not only blunted the Russian attack, but also recaptured territory seized by Russia in the early phase. Turning to the state of the war, though, 2 weeks ago, the US Council of Foreign Relations former President Poroshenko said that Ukraine was not attacking Russia. But this week we have seen 2 drone attacks on a Russian airport in the southern Kursk district and an industrial plant 80 kilometers from the Ukraine border, followed by massive Russian attacks on infrastructure, particularly power and civilians. Are we entering a new phase of the war as fighting on the front line becomes bogged down in winter?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here. And it's a great pleasure to come to Australian Institute of International Affairs and your chapter here in Melbourne. Today is my last public event of this year in Australia, as I'm going to Wellington for several days early next week, and then I'm off to Ukraine for 2 weeks. So today is pretty much, and I'm wrapping up, and whatever is going to happen next year. So happy to be here. And of course, I don't know, you asked a very specific question, which is related to what's just happened 2-3 days ago. And of course, it's a valid question. I don't think we are entering a new phase of war. We are targeting military sites, and we are destroying Russian bombers, which shelling Ukraine and killing Ukrainians. So I think they are a legitimate target for Ukraine.
Yes, so it's very clear that Russia is reciprocating by targeting the Ukrainian people. And
no, we are reciprocating because they are targeting.
Oh, yes, no,
it's a very important distinction, and it's because it was Russia which attacked Ukraine, and therefore we have to make it very clear, So we did attack Russia. Russia attacked us 8 years ago. And what has happened is what we've seen. And I think the fact that the response of the West was so weak in 2014 is the reason Russia attacked us again this year. And we have to go back and see the reaction of the world to the invasion of Georgia in 2008. And the sanctions which were imposed on Russia, actually pretty much none, and Russia felt emboldened. Therefore, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and has been, the hybrid warfare has been going on for 8 years. And they kind of use the time to beef up their army, to mount a major attack earlier this year.
Yes, yes, indeed. You're quite right. That was the Russian response. They sought to further increase their bombardment and the misery being inflicted on the Ukrainian people. Now, in that context, I understand there are around 7.6 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and perhaps 8 million Ukrainians displaced within the Ukraine itself. This is a massive number given Ukraine's population of around 43 million. Just how bad is the situation in Ukraine, particularly with the upcoming winter hardships, which clearly Russia is seeking to capitalize on?
Look, I was in Ukraine 5 weeks ago. I spent a week in Kiev, and it's getting more and more difficult, to be frank. Apart from having a large number of internally displaced people, many people who became refugees in Europe, Russia has destroyed by now about 50% of the electricity energy infrastructure, deliberately targeting power generation, water supplies, electricity grids, and is really inflicting a major damage to the civilians, which is a war crime in itself. However, there's not much we can do about it. We just have to survive. So we now have blackouts in many different cities to balance off the energy system. But you can imagine if there is a big city, and you don't have electricity, usually there is no water as well. So the cities become unlivable. So it's becoming more and more difficult to endure that. Nevertheless, the plan of Vladimir Putin is to put pressure on the Ukrainian civilians so that they would put pressure on the Ukrainian leadership. But I don't think it's working, actually, because I think all it's causing is because I've been to Ukraine 3 times already since I came here to Australia, going there 4th time next week. So I was in Ukraine when the war started. So I'm really can feel what the sentiment is and how united people are. And in a way, that has been a major nation building exercise for us. And we have now having gone through this experience for the past 9 months, we see a birth of a Ukrainian political nation, and it's really phenomenal to see how united Ukrainians are today, and how determined they are to repel the enemy, and the general sentiment of how they feel about Russia. And it's interesting. When I was growing up, and I didn't see much of the Soviet Union, to be frank. I was 10 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed. But I could still in the 90s, it was still pretty much the legacy of the Soviet Union growing up in the 90s. And hearing different stories from 2 sides of my family about the Soviet Union, about what it was and how evil it was, right? And then, of course, as a student of history, of international relations history, in that respect, you learn about what Russians have been doing as an empire, and for them, this is pretty much we're going through our post-colonial period in a way, and Russia, as a former empire, cannot tolerate that there could be a country next door speaking a similar language, where still a lot of people speak the Russian language, but which could become a democracy. And I think that has been an existential threat for the regime of Vladimir Putin, that there could be a country which could be more prosperous than Russia, and which could actually have freedom of speech, which could have democracy, which have elected parliament, elected leadership, it was something that was very difficult to conceal, even despite all the Russian propaganda, that actually this is what Russian people would actually may want to crave for, because there is a good example out there. And apart from different other things which could have probably motivated Vladimir Putin to invade, but it really has prompted him to act. And we can only guess what were the reasoning behind that. Was it because he felt that there would be no unity in the West? Maybe he thought he could really take over Ukraine in 10 days. And maybe he thought that Biden was weak, Macron was waiting for elections, there was a new government in Germany, and that there was a comedian running the country, and he felt that he would just run away, but he didn't. And now I'm having Zelensky recognized as a person of the year by the Time magazine. This is huge. And I think this really demonstrates to the world the resilience of the Ukrainian people and how we were able to get all united and mobilized under this existential threat coming from Russia. And it's a different, changes your perspective of many different things. You know, it just, when you just see it very close, when you see the explosions very close, when you can hear that, and you're there with your family, it kind of gives you a different perspective on life. And I often speak here in different audiences in Australia, and I'm asking this question very often in different audiences, that how many people in the room are ready to die fighting for Australia?
Well, I think many would. Were we facing an existential threat? But the response of the Ukrainian people has been dramatic evidence of the solidarity and courage of the people.
Yes, yes, exactly. But I think we need to create a sense of urgency. And because if 10 years ago you asked me if Russia would invade Ukraine, I would say, oh, well, that's impossible. Why would that happen? 8 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine and the war started. And you see, it just, you wouldn't believe that in the 21st century, that could be basically the largest deployment of troops in Europe that since the Second World War, that you would hear about actually concentration camps. You would hear about the use of rape as a way to terrify the population. You would hear about mass executions, and you would hear about torture rooms. 1.5 million people are forcefully deported to Russia. Kids are being abducted. Many children were abducted in Ukraine, sent to Russia. 600 children were killed in this war.
Yeah, the human cost is absolutely tragic. And as you say, we had thought that we had left that era of mass land conflict in Europe, at least, well behind. Moving on, you talk about the start of the war. It's a very interesting dimension because one of the features at the early stage of the war was the use of cyber warfare to seek to disarm Ukraine. You know, there were the two massive attacks on Ukraine, I think in 2015, 2016, which put out your power system. And then literally hours before the tanks rolled into Ukraine, Russia brought down the Ukraine's telecommunications communication system. Did we in the West, did the international community miss something? Why were we so caught off guard by Putin's invasion? Did we miss the warning signals? And how can we actually better in the future deal with threats like this?
There is a bigger question. So there's one question about cybersecurity, and definitely cyber warfare has been going on for a long time now, for 8 years. Russia has been targeting our civilian infrastructure. Also, we remember 2017 of a malware called NotPetya, which actually affected many companies in Ukraine, but also it went out to Europe. Many banks were taken down with that malware, and it took them a while before they could get back to normal. But the fact that Russia has been attacking us for past 8 years, I think we've been able to build our own capabilities of how to deal with that. It's difficult for me to kind of gauge the efficiency of that because I'm not an expert on cybersecurity. But I would encourage you, there was an article in one of the recent Economists about cyber warfare. It's a very good article if you've seen it. If not, I would recommend reading it. They go into big details, what Russians been able to achieve and what they were not able to achieve in Ukraine for the reasons which that article narrates, but it's a bit too technical. I read it actually the other day, but it gives you a good example on that. But I think nobody is immune to cybersecurity because look, the attack on Optus and the attack on Medibank, right? Look, it's all sponsored by the government of Russia. I mean, especially the Medibank. It's pretty clear. The fact that it comes from Russia, it's pretty clear it's sponsored by the Russian government. It's just very difficult to prove it, right? But I have no doubts about it. The fact that there was information released on Albanese is 100%, then it all comes from Russia and Russian intelligence, basically. And that's important to keep this in mind, and there will be more of that coming. And I think privacy is non-existent in today's world. Forget about it. It just doesn't exist anymore. Whatever is on your phone is accessible. And whatever this is just a reality of today's world, unfortunately. And of course, countries, democracies, and are very much vulnerable because of that. And democracies are generally very vulnerable because malign foreign powers know how to undermine democracy, and they will use your freedom of speech to influence you and to actually undermine you from within. They will go and find the weaknesses in your society, and they will amplify those weaknesses. They will be able to, and it's easy to do it now these days. In today's digitalized world, you can hack something, you can get access to information, you can then divulge that information, you can undermine governments, you can undermine societies. And we've seen it happening. We've seen what Russia's been doing in Britain, what Russia's been doing in the US elections, what Russians could have attempted doing here during Euro elections, but at the same time, they are here and they're very present. It's easy now to create video content out of Moscow and get a narrator from Victoria, and nobody would ever guess that that video was produced in Moscow, right? You would never know it, and because the accent will be Australian, and it's cheap. In the old days, when Soviet propaganda was very dull. It was very boring. Russian propaganda today is actually very engaging. It's very emotional. It's very theatrical. Therefore, it's very powerful. And it's, and for somebody who doesn't know much about the history of Eastern Europe, it may even sound quite compelling, because some people may buy into the argument that this is Russia's response to the NATO expansion to the east. And this is bollocks, I'm sorry. The fact that NATO expanded to the east so slowly is the reason why we have this war. Very simple. Because if Ukraine joined NATO in 2012 or 28, when we applied for membership and we're about to get it, and France and Germany blocked us, has actually emboldened Putin to invade. As simple as that. I mean, this is a reality. We just have to live with that. Because if Ukraine joined NATO, Russia would never invade. They never wanted us to be part of NATO so that they would never be able to invade us then. That was the plan for a long time. And it's very important to keep that in mind. So the fact that now Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, now Russia has to preemptively strike and invade these two countries, correct? Look, it's now a huge border, 30 kilometers to St. Petersburg. NATO is going to be 30 kilometers to St. Petersburg now, and they get a huge NATO border there. According to that theory, they must invade Finland and Sweden, correct? Because to prevent them from having to join NATO, that's if we keep the logic that it was that they invaded Ukraine because they were so afraid of NATO.
So perhaps Belarus might be the next to go.
If indeed that was Russia's motivation, I think what you're illustrating is exactly how counterproductive that was, that it's actually accelerated the process of the incorporation of new members into NATO, and in many ways has revitalized it. It raises the question about sanctions against Russia, and are we doing enough there? I mean, it's interesting that the EU estimates that Russia's GDP will drop by 4.5%. Production is down 3/4 apparently of motor vehicles. Their planes can't fly because they can't get the parts. But at the same time, oil and gas exports are booming and prices are high, and that's creating an inflow of income into Russia. So should the West be doing more? What more can we do to sanction Russia?
Look, we need sanctions work. We need more sanctions. Of course, we need to say no to Russian gas in Europe. It's going to take a while before we're going to get there. And I understand oil is no longer being bought by the European nations, but at the same time, big nations like China and India, they buy the Russian oil. They get a discount on that, and Russia is selling lots of oil to other countries.
Yes,
and they might make money. So I don't know how to solve this issue, because I get the point that there are big countries which need energy, and they need to take care of their populations, and they would still buy the resource, they buy the commodity. But at the same time, by buying that commodity, they are funding the war, they're funding Russian military to kill Ukrainians, right? As cynic as it gets, but that's a fact. How can we stop it? I don't know, but we definitely need to impose more sanctions on Russia, to take Russia off SWIFT, to take completely, just paralyze their banking system. That's the way to do it.
yeah. Well, there has, of course, been a move to take them out of SWIFT in a number of areas, so more comprehensive sanctions. And at the same time, considering how to broaden the coverage of those sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, during the past 20 years, Russians have been working very actively throughout the world, and they've been buying politicians in Europe, buying politicians everywhere. And we now hear about numerous cases. It becomes more and more known what Russia has been doing and how they do it. And they have different ways how they do it, right? And they've been cooperating very closely. They've been just paying bribes. They've been collecting compromise of different people, and motivation of different politicians in Europe could be diverse. But the Russian presence was very heavy there, and weaponizing energy, weaponizing, because for Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, that was a project, that was a political project. And I think it's good that we now realize, and everybody can admit that it was a political project. It had nothing to do with commerce. And unfortunately, when it started, and for us Ukrainians, and I've myself participated in many different discussions in Germany and Brussels, where we talked about Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 as the fact that once they're complete, Russians will invade us directly. Nobody kind of took it seriously.
It's quite clear that the war is not only a disaster for the Ukraine, but, and I even hesitate to put it in the same equation, it's having a major impact on the world economy, the international economy. And there were suggestions even in the last week that the US could go into recession next year. Clearly, the EU is going to suffer an energy crisis over this winter, and the people. And it was interesting, we were talking to the German ambassador just last week, and he said that they absolutely recognized that this was part of the cost of supporting Ukraine, and the German people were united in bearing that cost. But is there a risk to European unity as some of the countries start to focus on their own domestic concerns? I mean, President Zelensky has been very successful in recruiting European support. But is there a concern that this could start to waver, at least in some countries, in the face of their own domestic challenges, particularly as we head into winter?
Look, I think this is the bet of Vladimir Putin, actually, that because of the winter coming, all the European democracies become very vulnerable, because if there are people who have to pay a higher price for their gas and utilities, they will be unhappy, right? You're paying higher price. Are you happy? Raise a hand who's happy. I mean, do you all understand that the reason you pay it because Russia invaded Ukraine? That's one reason. That's it. Are you willing to give more weapons to Ukraine so we can stop it?
Yeah.
Good. So I think the response is very clear. I think Europeans have to provide more weapons, including Americans, so we can actually stop the volatility of the global commodity markets. We can get back to normal. This is when the prices will normalize, both on a kind of food side. You know, we can stop the food crisis, which is going on right now, because Ukraine is one of the biggest exporters of food products in the world. We provide 10% of the global supply of wheat, 18% of the, or 17% of barley, 50% of sunflower oil, and many countries in the Middle East and Africa depend on our food. And all this, you know, global supply chains have been undermined by COVID, but they've been further exacerbated by this war. And this is really a major implication for the international economy and the situation out there. Everybody is interested in actually getting back to normal. But that normal will only happen once we repel the Russians, once we restore our sovereignty, and once Vladimir Putin is down and gone. Unfortunately, that's a fact.
That raises the question of what is the route to peace? I mean, the US and the G7 have indicated that a peace settlement should be based on Ukraine gaining all its territory, receiving reparations from Russia, and being able to sign up to security agreements with the West. President Putin, by contrast, has denied the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state and wants to incorporate, or has incorporated illegally seized territories into Russia. So what does Ukraine see as a viable route to peace?
That's a very easy question, because 90% of Ukrainians believe we're going to win the war, and they believe we have to restore our sovereignty. And that's just what it is, John. And that's the route to peace. We will liberate Ukraine, and we don't want any of the Russian territory, and that's all theirs. And actually, they don't want the land. You see, it's very important to understand that Russia does not want any land. They want to destroy our country as a nation, as our statehood. That's the point. And they need this ceasefire to actually resupply, regroup, and mount another attack. So it's not about the territory that they actually need or crave for. It's just undermining Ukraine, and eventually they will still do it. So the only response we can get is actually get tanks, get long-range missiles, and jets. That's a road to peace. As abstract, I mean, as really, it's difficult to believe into that, but that's the only way how we can achieve that. Because we've been able to liberate 50% of the land that Russians have occupied since the outbreak of war. We've demonstrated that we can actually push Russians out if we have the right weapons, right? We depend on the West, on those supplies. Australia was very good to Ukraine, has committed 90 Bushmasters. You've seen them in action, and its Bushmaster has become a symbol of Australian support now. The drones that were supplied, the M113s, which are armored personnel carriers on tracks, the howitzers, the ammunition for that, the anti-tank missiles, which were bought for us by Australia, they've all been really very efficient. But at the same time, for us to be able to be more efficient, we need infantry fighting vehicles, and we're not getting them yet. Bushmaster is not a tank. Bushmaster is only for the transport of the personnel. It's been used by our airborne troops and the special units to fight the Russians. And we have the motivation is out there. We need help with training, and we need equipment. And I think the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine at this scale more recently, this is what's going to bring down Vladimir Putin. And we just have to get all united around this one idea.
So if I understand what you're saying, you don't see that there is a room for compromise towards a negotiated peace. essentially Russia needs to withdraw, and I think most people would tend to support that view. But in that circumstance, as you point out, it's actually hard to imagine a lasting peace with the current regime remaining in power in Russia. Is it possible to achieve a lasting peace with the current regime? Could you trust the current regime?
I think, yeah, I think you know the answer, right?
I think I can infer it, but I suppose that the issue remains that if Russia remains hostile to the Ukraine and the West, do we actually face the prospect of a new Iron Curtain descending on Europe with Ukraine on the border?
Well, it's very likely. It's already happened. It's already happened. That's a fact. This is what we deal with, right? Look, Russia has demonstrated that they don't want democracy. They don't want to be part of the civilized world. They're out there, pursuing the idea of changing borders by force. This is just unheard of in the 21st century. I mean, why this war is so different from the war of the Second World War? This whole war is on this iPhone, right? You go there and you can find it, everything there. We'll never be able to forget it or forgive it. And now, being here in Melbourne, there is a Russian film festival out there. I mean, ask me how I feel about it. You want to talk about Russian culture? Let's talk about Russian culture. I grew up reading Russian books only because there were no Ukrainian books out there. You know that?
It's you touched upon the various crimes Russia has committed in Ukraine, and they are horrendous. But war crimes have traditionally been very hard to successfully prosecute. How important is a public conviction of wrongdoing, prosecution of war crimes to the Ukrainian people?
It is extremely important. I think it's as important as it is for Australians to see Russians being held accountable for the MH17, which killed 38 Australians, correct? 38 Australians out there in 2014. And seeing that the two Russians being indicted, one Ukrainian indicted, who was working with the Russians, operating the Buk missile system, which killed all those innocent people on that passenger flight, was extremely important for those families who I met at the ceremony for the MH17 this year. So that's in that same sense, it's extremely important. And we now have teams of people working, which are including different investigators from America, from Britain. I heard somebody even from Australia is participating in collecting the evidence, in documenting that, and making sure that Russians are held accountable. Look, I was with Prime Minister Albanese in Ukraine on the 3rd of July, and we went to Bucha, and Bucha is a little rural town on the outskirts of Kyiv. That little village had 462 civilians killed by the Russians. They killed them because they just could kill them. And you're out there on the grounds of the church where they show you a place and they said, oh, we had a big hole here, 200 people were buried here. And when you're kind of in that spot, listening to witness accounts who saw it happen, and you hear that story, right? I mean, how do you feel about it, right?
Well, even reading it thirdhand, it's really tragic and very emotionally moving. So it can only be so much more so for people much closer.
Absolutely. And you know what Russians did? They would walk from door to door and ask people, what do you do for a living? If you were a teacher from school, you were executed immediately. Why? Because teachers were considered to be those, especially teachers of Ukrainian language or Ukrainian culture, or Ukrainian literature. This is a genocidal war. And this is something we have to live with. The whole society is traumatized. Everybody's traumatized. Mental health is going to be a big issue as we go forward. Ukraine will need lots of help with that. And I really hope that help will be coming from Australia as well, because this is something which is very difficult to go through, remaining still focused. And look, so I was in Kyiv when the war started, and I packed my car, my 2 suitcases, my 2 kids. My son is 5, my daughter was 18. We fled Kyiv, and I took my family to Romania. And as they crossed border on foot, I stayed in Ukraine. And my son asked my wife, how come we're in Romania? And my wife said, well, Romania is part of NATO, so Russians will not bomb NATO. So when we came here to Australia, my son asked my wife, is Australia part of NATO? Will Russians invade?
Looking to the future, clearly Ukraine's first and foremost priority is success on the battlefield. But history suggests that stability, order, and security would need to follow fairly soon after any victory to ensure success. How is Ukraine preparing for that future, given the economic damage that has been suffered?
Look, just also partially what I wanted to share on the previous question on the peace. Ukraine is the biggest contributor to the world peace. In 1994, we gave up the 3rd largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. As part of the deal, we also dismantled our strategic bombers, which were just destroyed. Could be very useful these days, right? And show me any other country that has done it. At that time, India and Pakistan developed their own nuclear programs and developed their own nuclear weapons. Ukraine gave it up all voluntarily. And we got assurances from a number of countries, including Russia, that our borders will be inviolable and will not be violated at any stage, right? So and it was called the Budapest Memorandum that we signed. So, the recent statement of Emmanuel Macron about some security guarantees for Russia sounded very ludicrous, and they were not well received in Ukraine or in many other parts of the world. Because I think we can offer probably Russia security guarantees. They give up their nuclear weapons, and we can sign a Budapest Memorandum with Russia as well. And we can assure them we will not invade. And I think it's very important, John, that of course for us, for me personally, I only see one solution for us. Ukraine joins NATO. That's it. I know it's not an easy one, but it's a political decision, and it's up to 30 member states to decide, right? But at the same time, for us to go on, we have to have strong military, and we have to have strong economy. Ukraine will have to be rebuilt, and lots of work needs to happen. It's going to probably take decades, but for us, having Russia next door, the only way how we can deter Russia is to be able to have strong military out there.
And for that, you need support from both Europe and a strong economy, which makes both joining the EU at some point and NATO a high priority. But Western officials have commented in the past about the state of internal administration in Ukraine. Since independence, Ukraine has swung from a pro-Russia to pro-West, pro-reform, anti-reform. And it's interesting that even President Poroshenko started on a program of reform and seeking to root out corruption. Now, clearly, what President Zelensky can do in the current circumstances is limited. But what is the current government's approach to reform within Ukraine itself? And what are the prospects?
Ukraine is going to come different out of this war, right? And we already understand it. Given the cost and given this experience, and given, if you look at the people of Ukraine currently, and you look at the top political leadership in Ukraine, you will see how different it is from the top political leadership in Russia. We already have a new generation running the country, whereas Russia is still stuck in the as a hostage of the old generation. And that old generation has stolen future from their kids and grandchildren, right? Ukraine is run by a president who's 44 years old, who generated a big upheaval in the political world, in the political history of Ukraine by becoming the president and by actually bringing 70% of new people into the parliament, which was phenomenal in terms of actually overhauling the whole political establishment in Ukraine, which was a big development. It was a huge success. And the fact is that now that what we, are living through gives you an idea that people really want to have a proper country, a well-governed country, a rule-based economy, with functioning courts, with no corruption. And it's out there. We want to be part of the European Union, we want to be part of NATO. And both of these aspirations been, well, at least EU has been recognized. We are now recognized as a candidate member for the EU. It's still going to take a long time before we're going to make it. But the fact that we are recognized as a candidate member creates a mechanism of how we're going to be driving our reforms and changing so that we meet the standards and we can join the EU. And I think this is a top priority for the new government, for the next government, for the next generation of people, to actually make sure that we become members of the EU.
You touched earlier upon the enormous Ukrainian wave of patriotism generated by the war. In many ways, that could actually help root out the old sources of opposition to reform and may actually have a dividend into the future in terms of this whole reform agenda.
So, can you please repeat the question?
Sorry,
because
I guess I'm commenting that the patriotism that people have seen that may well lead to a change in the overall atmosphere within the Ukraine, so that previous sources of opposition to reform may be eliminated or no longer have a voice as Ukraine moves into a peaceful outcome.
No, for sure. Look, and then you need to look a bit about at Ukraine's political economy, right?
Yeah.
And Ukraine's political economy has been affected by the oligarchs, right? And oligarchs are those people who were able to privatize Soviet assets for peanuts in the 90s by having the right connections and using different ways how to influence the redistribution of wealth in those days. And they've accumulated those assets. They bought large TV companies and media assets, which were instrumental in influencing political outcome of any elections. And they've been able to generate influence and then milk the country, milk state-owned enterprises, and make lots of money on the way, right? So now, and Ukrainian society has been fighting that for a long time, and tolerance towards that is drying up. And after this war, I think it's going to be gone completely. Yeah. So, and I think this is what's going to be a major transformation from, the departing from this influence of these big industrial groups who have monopolies in certain sectors, which is unacceptable, and who will be able to create a different country. Where we will have a new generation of people in the parliament, in the government, and just building the country according to the best practices that we can borrow from our friends and allies. And I think that's the way forward, I think, and this is what we want. And look, it's changing. It just takes some time, it doesn't happen that quick. And of course, now we have to deal with the war. So once all resources are down there, the huge drop in our GDP. Nobody even knows what the official statistics is, but it's really, really difficult. When our Black Sea ports, 70% of our exports go from Black Sea ports. So we couldn't export anything until July. That was really extremely difficult for the Ukrainian economy, because transporting agriculture commodities by train or trucks doesn't make sense. It becomes golden wheat, which nobody can afford. So it's because at the end of the day, agriculture is all about logistics. If you can't get it cheap to the final consumer, it's not going to work. And that's a problem. And now that we've been able to unlock at least supports for agricultural products is good. But we also the biggest, not biggest, we're a big producer of iron ore, as you are in Australia. And now it's not that easy to get iron ore because we cannot get it through Black Sea ports.
Well, that's a very positive potential outcome to a real peace dividend. And on that very positive note, let me open up our discussion to questions from the floor. We obviously have keen interest in everything you have to say, Basil. And so I'd like to open it to anyone who would like to ask questions in the audience or indeed from the Zoom.
We've got a roving mic which will come around. I'll just put one in from Zoom. Basil, you talked about the Bushmasters, which you said have become a bit iconic. But is there any other specific support that Australia has given, or is there more that Australia could be doing, and how much attention is that getting in Ukraine?
Look, thanks. Also at the outbreak of the war, Australia donated coal to Ukraine. It was 70,000 tons of coal, which made it to Ukraine in July, which was a great help. Ukraine made another request to the Australian government to provide more coal. That would be very helpful. It's going to take about a month or 2 months to make it to Ukraine, but our winter lasts pretty much until late March, even early April. It can still be quite cold. So that energy, that coal from Australia could be really life-saving for us. So they could be very helpful. In terms of the military side, Bushmasters are doing a good job. We'll be asking for more of those. Australia committed 90. The 2/3 of them being delivered by now. Some others are in a pipeline and are coming. And of course, what we need right now is 155mm ammunition. If you got any in your garage, let me know. I can pick it up on the way. I'm going there next week, so I can take it with me. If not, let me know where it is, because we really need it. It's really in high demand. But it's not only, I mean, the whole world has run out of 155mm ammunition. Those of you who have been in the military in the past, it's nobody, because this war, I mean, have really seen it. I mean, this is the use of artillery has been taken to a new level, and how much that artillery was used. So Australia spends about 15,000 rounds per year in training, and we can spend it in 3 days in Ukraine today, right? At the speed that we use it, right? So it's really, and the global stockpiles are gone, and the production is not yet there. So I think it's very important for Australia to have your own production. I understand it's now happening, but it doesn't happen that quick. It takes a bit of time, and production needs to be done here, and this is what it is. But look, there have been some very good companies in Victoria out here who've been providing and making some very efficient drones that we've used. And I'm not going to be naming the companies, but they know who they are. And also, so defense industry of Australia is quite impressive in terms of innovation. And I've traveled throughout the country and met many defense industry companies, and I'm really impressed with the innovations. And now Ukraine is a testing ground for all these weapons. But I think there will be a lot for you to learn once this war is over, because at the end of the day, we'll be happy to share that experience with our allies and friends. And I think this will be very useful for your Australian Defence Forces to see how this war was fought and what is out there, what lessons learned, and what needs to happen here to deter any potential enemy that you may get as you go. But the situation has changed. Global security has been undermined, and the implications are everywhere, and we don't know what's going to happen here in the region, and how it's going to affect the security of the Indo-Pacific, and what other threats could be there. But it's pretty clear that you need to have your own strong military capabilities to deter any potential appetite for an invasion. But you see, as you have mentioned, that the world is buying Russian oil and gas, right? And the reason is very simple, because for many countries, energy security is a priority. And energy security has undermined climate change, because all of a sudden, if you don't have energy for your own people, do you care about climate change that much? As cynic as it gets, you know? No, because at the end of the day, if your own people don't have heating in their house or their industry stops, I mean, the issue of climate change becomes just like second, I mean, it's not that important anymore, right? So this whole thing, which was created, it's really Russia has undermined the entire international cooperation is climate change. Germany and Poland are restarting coal mines, for God's sake. Was it smart to phase out nuclear power in Germany? I don't know. Now there are different discussions out there. Was it sustainable to buy Russian gas? No. But now it's kind of, we can reverse it pretty quickly because the whole industry depends on the Russian gas. And this is interesting of how we're going to go. But food security is a big issue. Because at the end of the day, look at this. This is just very simple. There are two countries out there which are going to have 2 billion people, right? And they need to feed those people. They need food and water. Where are they going to get food and water? What if wars, the future wars will be fought for water? That's clear already, right? With all the deserts coming to big parts of the world, with climate change, water will be a scarce resource. Who's got water out here in the region? And food and proteins and beef, right?
I think there's a question at the back there.
My name is Patrick Moore. I'm a member of the Institute. It's very hard sitting here to imagine when the war can end and how can it end. And therefore, you must be planning for a long war. What arises from the question, of course, is that how are you dealing with foreign help for a very long-term period?
How we can secure foreign help for a long-term period? I think it's, Ukraine is out there being a sponsor of European security pretty much. And we are there defending democracy, we're defending human rights, we're defending all those fundamental values and principles which are so important for every Australian. And we believe that the fact which we are out there at the front lines and paying the high price for that gives us a moral ground to be asking for that help to come in. And as long as we have the unity of the West, and we'll have that pipeline of support, we'll be able to fight. If it dries up, it will be pretty difficult for us. Because at the end of the day, Russia is still a bigger country. They have more people. And as you have rightly pointed out, they've been making more money from the sale of gas and oil than before. But the technical sanctions which were imposed on Russia actually work. Because they can't, even their defense industry, they can't really produce the guided missiles because they don't get the chips, right? Of course, they use different ways how to circumvent those sanctions and try to source it through third parties. And I think in some cases they could be successful, but it's important that we don't let them do it. And there is out there, we can prevent that from happening. But at the end of the day, look, there is no other country in the world who wants the war to stop. Don't take me wrong, right? I'm not warmongering here. Ukrainians want peace more than anybody in the world. It's pretty clear.
Yeah. Another question at the back.
Hi, my name is Peter Kuzmin. I'm a Russian-Australian anti-war activist. I fully support Ukrainian fight against the Russian invasion until complete liberation of all territory, including Crimea, and reparations have to be paid. But I have to question some of the strategies used. Recently, in an interview, you said that to the Sydney Morning Herald, you said that the majority of Russians here in Australia, they support the invasion and they hate Australian values. I'm confident this is not the case. My question is it really an effective strategy to cancel Russian culture and Russian people? Wouldn't it be better for us to join our forces in the fight against Putin? Because there are plenty of Russians who hate this regime, who are oppressed by this regime, and both in Russia and especially abroad. We are not supporting what's happening.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I want to apologize if I hurt your feelings by saying what I said to Sydney Morning Herald. Maybe it was not my best comment that I've ever made, to be frank. Nevertheless, my observations of what I've seen in different social media in Australia, in the Russian-speaking groups, so my analysis comes from reading those groups. So I read the Russian-speaking community in Australia, and I'm pretty much amazed because those people live in Australia. They have access to very, I think, very distant reporting by Australian media, which is quite accurate. Nevertheless, they tend to believe what they hear on Russian television. Living in Australia, many of them probably have Australian passports by now, and they're Australian citizens. So this is what amazes me. Tell me, I don't know the percentage, I didn't really count, but that was my general sentiment. Of course, there are many exceptions, and there are people like you, and there are others who are out there and demonstrating with Ukrainians, helping Ukrainian refugees. I know that, but still, I'm still surprised by seeing many others. And it's not only the case of Australia, it's the case of Russian people in America, in Canada, in Western Europe, where they live. And they still, a lot are dominated their kind of, situation in Ukraine. They read it through the lens of the Russian media, which is manipulative and which is just wrong, right? It's just, people are being influenced by the Russian propaganda. And at the same time, so look, I agree with you that there could be some nuances, but at the same time, for us, Ukrainians, and this is something which is very important for Russians to understand. Being part of Russian Empire, Ukrainians were colonized, Ukrainians were killed. The cream of the crop of Ukrainian nation was deliberately destroyed by the Russians through the famine in 1932-33, by the executions of all our elites, the best writers, poets, composers were killed in 1937 because they were seen as a source of nationalism, right? Then if you look at the Second World War, during the Second World War, the casualties of the Soviet Union were exceeding 20 million people. Ukrainians were the ones who suffered the most, followed by Belarus, and only then by the Russians. So going through all this experience for us, now very often Russian culture is a symbol of that empire, because with Russian culture come Russian tanks. You remember how Putin justified his invasion. He's protecting Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. But don't we understand how this Russian-speaking people became Russian-speaking? 100 years of Russification and actually destroying Ukrainian identity made those people forget their native language. That's the whole point. And also forceful migration of people, like people of Donbass, some people of industrial parts of Donbass were populated by the Russians. Have Russians deported Crimean Tatars, which are indigenous people of Crimea, to Central Asia? Most of them died on their way. They brought in Russians to Crimea. How they kind of been, using demographics and forceful movement of people to change the demographics, right? So for us, no, look, I used to run a business. In my company, 30 people, when I left the company, half of them spoke Russian. Russian was never a problem in Ukraine. It's a myth. Everybody knows Ukrainian in Ukraine. So I never switched to Russian, though I know Russian fluently, because everybody could understand what I was saying in Ukrainian. So it was never an issue. The language was never an issue. So it was a myth that was created. And Putin believed that Russian-speaking people of Ukraine are actually Russian, but they are not. And now all my Russian-speaking friends all of a sudden switched into Ukrainian, and they just hate Russia and hate Russian. I'm sorry. This is what happens, because if Russian language becomes, a Russian culture becomes a source of rape, murder, and all this what's happening in Ukraine, this is a natural reaction you get. So it's like, it's becoming too painful. I mean, maybe there's some nuances, it's difficult to explain, because at the end of the day, I like reading Mikhail Bulgakov, and we had this major debates in Ukraine about Bulgakov. So Bulgakov, apart from, he's written many books, he lived in Kyiv for a long time. Master and Margarita is one of his, most famous books. I really like the book, the book is good. But he's written also a number of books about the period after the revolution in Russia, which was a period when Ukraine had a statehood, which was Ukrainian National Republic from 1917 to 1921. And his depiction of Kiev is very anti-Ukrainian, actually. It's Why God and what's the other book? What's the other book of Bulgakov about that period? Anyways, doesn't matter. It's really anti-Ukrainian, right? So there's big debate in Ukraine about what do we do with Bulgakov. There's a museum to Bulgakov in Kiev, and some people like him, some people don't like him. But the fact that he was depicting Ukraine in you know, being really anti-Ukrainian in those books, I mean, he doesn't talk really highly of the period, which for us is now very important, because this is where we derive our statehood from. That was a period when Ukraine had 4 years of independence. And actually, an uncle of my grandfather worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the Ukrainian National Republic. He was invited by Grushevsky to join the Foreign Service. And it's been a big part of his life when he fled to Canada, written books about that period of time, right? So it's becoming a bit complicated, you know, especially with respect to Russian culture. Because on one hand, there's nothing wrong with Swan Lake, right? Because Swan Lake is a world legacy, correct? But at the same time, Swan Lake is a flagship Russian ballet. And Ukraine has our own ballet, correct? Which may be not that known. But at the same time, we have it. And maybe the best ballet dancers were snatched by Russia because they were the most talented ones, and they're brought to Moscow, and they were glorifying Moscow, right? This is what happened. And this is what happened to many other famous people of Ukrainian origin who became big, or those who survived, who weren't not killed because they were seen as nationalists or whatever. But this is what it is. And you know, also like looking, maybe there's some other questions. Sorry.
No. I think what we might need to do at this point, we're about to lose our Zoom audience, but
Yeah.
I think the point that you've just made about the resurgence of the Ukrainian people is a really positive note upon which to lead this part of our discussion. Clearly, the war has demonstrated a spirit of patriotism, a national spirit, a national resurgence, which is carrying Ukraine through the enormous hardships that you have outlined so graphically today. I just want to thank you for that. And on behalf, I know, of everyone here, to wish through you, the people of Ukraine, all the very best possible in this terrible situation of suffering that you are going through. So, Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.